Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the show where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. Joining me today is Noah Laguda, founder of Noahsure Real Estate, who are international property experts. Welcome, Noah.
Thank you very much.
Not too far for you to travel, Noah.
Not at all, it's a few floors.
Not like your colleague who is Harvey Bowes, CEO of Harvey Bowes, property finance brokers, all the way from Wales.
Hello, Stephen.
Okay, well, we're going to get straight on with the questioning. Noah, you're going first. At what level do the panel think the upward trend of interest rates will have serious consequences for the housing market? And if serious, should the government intervene with assistance for mortgage holders?
Well, I'll answer the question sort of backward, as it were. And I do think, yes, the government should intervene to make sure that there is some sort of control. Because I had a client the other day call me saying that, she's received some frightening news, that her mortgage is going up from £400 a month to £2,500 at the end of the year, and she has to obviously sell up now. And it just shows maybe what's happening at the moment. And there's a lot of, for me, unrealistic panicking in regards to the lenders in terms of some of the rates they're giving, because it's really unfair. If someone's stuck on a variable, only God knows what's going to happen to them. And I think it's quite frightening, to be honest. I think it is a shocking reality of what's actually happening, and something definitely, I believe, does need to be done. But at the same time, it's also important to not over panic, because I'm sure that there are some lenders out there that are able to sort of, stem the tide, as it were, for first-time buyers and, things of that nature.
I think we're in a different world now, moving forwards in terms of where rates are going to be. So if you look back a couple of years, Mark Carney, when he was in charge of the Bank of England, said that, famously quoted, half is the new norm. And so we've all been enjoying interest rates, where the bank are offering rates of 1% for a fixed rate for a period for residential borrowers, maybe 2% for buy-to-let borrowers on average. And, that time has gone. So rates are now being repriced. But one of the reasons why we're seeing a big increase in lender rates right now, the rates that are offered to mortgage borrowers, is because it's very difficult for the bank to be able to predict what those 5-year rates are going to be. And that's because, like you say, they're buying money in, or they're borrowing money in order to lend money out. And it's incredibly difficult to price. I think when we move forwards from here, when things settle down a little bit in terms of the direction that the government and the Bank of England are going in, and I think if inflation becomes more under control, it'll be easier for the banks to predict, and maybe we're not going to see such high rates as we see right now. So the period of uncertainty is causing higher rates than we might have otherwise seen. Inflation is a significant factor here. So the Bank of England are clearly looking at inflation as one key. And then, as the economy as a whole, what we're looking at is what's happening to the UK's debt and GDP ratio. So there's the politicians and the Bank of England are trying to solve the same problem from two different directions. And the uncertainty that's creating is resulting in the markets responding in the way they're responding. So every day we're seeing dramatic changes, different announcements. And as soon as that settles down, lenders will be able to predict. And I think the rates will just drop back a little bit, but we're not going to see 3.5% fixed rates anymore.
I echo everything that you said, Harvey. And what I would say as well is, could there be opportunities within the crisis? And that's something that you've got to look at, and that's how I obviously speak to my clients, is what opportunities can you find within the crisis? Are house prices going down maybe to offset some of this? Are people forced to sell up at a price they normally wouldn't? Things of that nature. So it's kind of, for those who still want to be involved in property and get involved, could there be, opportunities within this crisis? And I would like to think that there could be.
Howard, your question. Do the experts think that the accelerated rise in interest rates we're experiencing will have a negative effect on the bank's attitude to funding speculative property investment, development projects and portfolio building? And if so, what might those changes be? Are we just going to go back to higher deposits to give banks better margins and their security? Or?
I think there's potential for that. So I mean, it's evident at the moment that the banks don't feel that we're going to see a large correction of house prices, because as it stands, they are still being quite positive, and higher level products are still available. So if you look at certain lenders are still in the market with the higher loan to values, showing they've got confidence in property values. But where we are seeing a significant change, especially in the buy-to-let investment world and in the development world, is that the banks they've increased the stress test. So that now, whereas previously they would measure the stress test, so in other words, let's say your rental income was £1,500 a month and you could borrow a mortgage where the payment came up to £1,000, and they would measure it, let's say, against 125% cover of an interest rate of, say, 5%. That was a normal sort of cover for many lenders. Now they've moved that. So actually it's 145% of 7%. So whereas before, for your £1,000 mortgage, let's say for argument's sake, you needed £1,500 a month rent or £1,300 a month rent, now you need a lot more rent. What that's going to do in the marketplace, I believe, is it's going to mean that there are more mortgage prisoners. So people that can't refinance onto a new deal and get stuck on the standard variable, as Noah discussed earlier. So they're going to have higher interest, and we could actually have property investors that have a negative cash flow from their property portfolio, especially if rent controls came in to stop rents being increased.
Now that's another subject. Now, Howard, I know you just wanted to come back on something on the question of what effect the interest rates would have on the housing market. There was something extra you wanted to say in the last couple of minutes of this half.
Yeah, so it was covering actually that key point. The question came back around. So, if something like rent controls came into play, that would stop rents increasing naturally with the level of inflation we have. And of course, homeowners and home renters are rightfully concerned about the current position. But if rent controls came into place, that would restrict the rents, which would then mean that borrowers, landlords, now can't meet the new stress test, which means they can only borrow less. And that would possibly drive house prices down in the more affordable housing sector, than the typical rental sector.
Okay, well, I kind of get that, but I'm also thinking, reading the headlines, that the government have taken off the stress tests for private mortgage takers, haven't they?
Yeah, so we've seen some interesting steps.
Isn't that a contradiction?
Well, we've seen some interesting steps that have led towards, the inflationary period that we've had now. So definitely the regulators have relaxed affordability rules, which has made it easier for the banks to lend more money to homeowners. And the thing to be remembered as well with homeowners is that, for your traditional homeowner with their own home, that they are not necessarily going to become mortgage prisoners. So the banks have a certain obligation to allow an existing borrower to take a new deal with that bank if they're offering something, rather than the higher standard variable. Okay. But that applies to homeowners, and those rules don't apply to buy-to-let and landlord investor.
Do you know what? I've been in property for, well, heaven knows how long. And I've never yet seen a government policy do any good for the housing market. I really just think they should mind their own business and let the market find its own levels and dictate its own policies.
Yeah,
but there we are. All right, well, that's all we've got time for in the first half of the show. So join me after the break when we'll be asking Howard and Noah more of your questions. Hello, welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and I'm sitting with Noah Laguda and Harvey Bowes. Welcome back, guys. Noah, do the panel think that the proposed government policy of relieving smaller developers from the obligation to build affordable housing really achieves very much other than to enhance development profits?
Oh, that's a good question. And
it's a bit political, really.
Yeah, it's a bit political, and I don't do politics, as you know. But what I would say is, look, affordable housing is needed. It is needed. There's no doubt about that. With the shortage we have of homes and the crisis that we face in regards to that, there is, affordable housing schemes that are needed. There's no doubt. But at the same time, I think it must be done on a scheme-to-scheme basis. You've got to have a look at a general overview of the scheme and then determine whether or not, that would be beneficial to the developer to have an affordable housing scheme put in there. Because, working with a lot of developers myself, they do obviously, a lot of them do borrow money, you know, at what can be sometimes very high interest rates. So they have to make some form of a profit, otherwise they can find themselves at a very, you know, very low negative, and that can have, you know, disastrous consequences for them and potentially for the overall development. So I believe on a scheme-to-scheme basis it should be looked at, and some developers definitely do need to be assisted, because at the end of the day, we all need a place to live, and if they're doing their bit to help, you know, increase the homes out there, then I guess there should be some more support for them.
Is it a developer's problem, though? Is it not the local authority's problem?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is. But at the same time, you know, we all have a duty of care and an obligation. You know, do we? Well, I think we do. I think we do.
Well, I think that's a lovely sentiment. I think
we should.
I haven't seen it work very often in the property industry.
I think we should. I think we should. You know, and that's something that definitely is, you know, we're wanting to bring to market, is some form of empathy and doing our bit. You know, which maybe, as you rightly said, hasn't been something that has been championed before in this industry.
Yes, and what do you think about the government's new policy of taking the responsibility away from the smaller developer, providing these, well, what used to be called 106 agreement homes?
Yeah, that's 106, yeah. Overall, I think it's more positive than negative.
Okay.
Yeah. Overall.
What do you think, Howard?
I think the smaller developers are walking a tightrope, because
they are, indeed.
What they have is the market at one level. This is what the market can demand, and then they have the councils pushing for affordable housing, and somewhere in between, someone's got to pay. And if it's eating the margin, it makes it much harder for developers to develop and to get homes there for the end users, and that's ultimately what the policy should be for.
Totally agree.
So I think to relax the policy and to allow developers to develop, and to be, as Noah said, to be more strategic as a council about where affordable housing might come in, is definitely a good plan.
I do think the government need to think very carefully. I mean, to get any kind of consistent policy is almost impossible. I mean, I can't remember now. Have we had 14 housing ministers in 10 years, I think it is, which means an average tenure of about 10 to 11 months. I mean, we're not going to get consistent policies, are we, if that's the sort of management that we're looking at. And I just also, I fidget a bit when the government come on and say, we're going to build 300,000 homes this year. Who's we? You know, is it Liz putting on a sort of fluorescent jacket and a hard hat and getting the cement out? I don't know. I just don't know who we is. And to encourage developers to do that and not sit on land, you've got to allow them to make profit. And if you kill all those profits with an insistence on too much social housing, too many
I see what you mean.
things, you know, I mean, I was involved in a development down here, and we were made to do all sorts of things that were deemed green at the time that turned out not to be. We were made to have artistic water sculptures for the development that cost tens and tens and tens of thousands of pounds, which never work for much more than a year, you know, and then just become an eyesore. I think we just need a different attitude, a more positive attitude.
I agree.
And more focused on really what we need, rather than what might be, you know, just ideologically right. But there we are, that's my view. Right, Howard, your second question. Are the commission charges made by brokers to banks and other funders influenced by the rising level of interest charges, or are they simply based on the capital amount borrowed? Obviously, with higher interest rates, the banks and others make more profit, and it could then be argued that higher fees could be justified, but of course would eventually be paid by the borrower one way or another.
It's absolutely right that ultimately it's the borrower that always pays. But the reality is that brokers in the market are paid a percentage based on the capital borrowed. So in the vast majority of cases, and therefore as interest rates are rising, that doesn't have a direct benefit for the broker. It's the size of the loan.
It's not a one-way rise, is it? It's just the margin, isn't it?
Correct, exactly. It's just the margin. And so, you know, are banks going to make more money as a result of the interest rate increases that we've seen? Well, it'll be interesting to see. whether they do or not. The fact is they're paying more for the money coming in, and they're lending the money out at a higher rate.
I think your sort of mild smile told me that the banks will be making more money.
I've been a broker for 20 years, and I think there's only ever one winner, and that's the bank, and we just have to play as best we can so that we win also.
What do you think, Noah?
I agree, and yeah, I do agree with what you're saying. And look, everything is sort of up in the air at the moment. You know, I mean, it is like a game of poker, to be honest, and everyone just literally has to play their best hand. You know,
I mean, we've gone through all these phases, haven't we, with mortgages, where you can just simply do a tick list online and get your mortgage over online and just within minutes, really. I think we're heading back to a far more inquisitorial sort of situation now. I'm guessing the questions you have to ask and
Indeed.
to justify to a lender that your client's good is getting more complex by the day, I would think, especially in these times.
Indeed. I do feel that it's definitely it is a challenging period for brokers. You know, they will have to do a lot more work than they've done before to find the best deal for their clients and to, you know, mitigate their needs as best as possible. There's a lot of work, you know. Like you said, before it was tick boxes, quick questions answered. Now they've got to be more dynamic and robust. You know, it's challenging times.
But the complexities of quantifying sort of credit suitability are a lot more complex today, aren't they? You've got the various credit reference agencies, which, I mean, seem to register sort of how many times you go to the loo each day. You know, I mean, they seem to be pretty comprehensive in their knowledge, and they share it, I think, quite well, don't they?
Yeah.
I presume you have to have access to those and make them form part of your presentation to a lender, do you?
Absolutely. So there's more intelligent data available now on each individual than there has been at any time before. And there's a whole raft of different agencies that information can come from. Some of those we're very familiar with, and there are some less familiar names that are organizations in the background. But the bank will look at the affordability overall. You know, they'll look at the viability of that character, their previous performance, the likeliness of future performance, to gauge whether somebody is a good bet to lend to, and whether they're a good, you know, whether they can afford that mortgage on an ongoing basis.
Okay.
The thing to remember, I think, is that in the residential world and then the buy-to-let investor world, they're assessed in two very, very different ways. And the key driver in the investment world, if you are buying property or developing property to hold, is what is the serviceability, what's the market rent, as well as the individual being stable. And then for the developer that's developing to sell, it's of course, what is the market going to be to sell? So
what's the exit strategy?
Exactly, what's the exit strategy? So, you know, when you're looking at the short-term funders, their pricing hasn't changed recently. It's still very similar to across the board to what it was before in the short-term funding space. And so what they're looking at really is what is the viability of the exit? You know, will these properties sell at the end of term, or will the developer be able to refinance if they intend to hold?
Okay, I can see that structure, and I can see how it works. What I do wonder sometimes is though there does seem a huge difference between the buy-to-let mortgage and the normal residential mortgage, in so much as that the stress testing is just based simply on rent, isn't it, on the buy-to-let scenario, rather than look at the individual at all. And even if they're relatively inexperienced landlords or property people, it doesn't seem to matter, which it surprises me.
There's a broad range of different lenders that offer different products available to borrowers. So you have some lenders that, you know, will run a credit score. Other lenders will run a credit search, but they don't attach a score to it, which might make it easier for somebody that doesn't score very highly on Experian or Equifax, for example. So you've got different lenders that look at that, as well as the rental viability. I mean, they always look at the rental viability. What's, I think, key at the moment is there are a handful of the main banks and some specialist lenders that do what we call top slicing, which is going to help investors that are right now looking to try and remortgage at these higher interest rates that we're seeing now. What they mean by top slicing is where they look at the rental viability, and if there's a shortfall to servicing that rent according to their own policy, they will look at the income that landlord has from the rest of the portfolio, or any outside income, non-property derived, perhaps from a corporate job in the background, besides the portfolio, assess that and say, well, actually, if there is a shortfall, Can this landlord, can this investor afford that buy-to-let mortgage as well as some of the others in the portfolio? And they will take a view on that.
Right, that sounds incredibly caring for a lender. Do you find that attitude has changed since COVID? I mean, one of the things we get on Property TV a lot of time, a lot of landlords, a lot of developers, a lot of commercial landlords will say that the interaction between banks, borrowers, tenants has got so much better. The engagement has got so much better since COVID. We've all learned to talk to each other. And that sounds like a good example.
Yeah, so we've always had top slicing. It's been around for a number of years, but the market hasn't needed it. So only a small selection of lenders have had that offer. But what we have seen since COVID, and you're absolutely right, Stephen, is that more lenders have moved into that space, and there are more lenders that see a need for it, and they're trying to get those policies through now so that they can offer that to landlords as well.
Okay, great stuff. Well, I'm going to say a big thank you to Noah Laguda, co-founder of Noahsure Real Estate. Thank you, Noah, for coming in.
My pleasure.
And to Howard Bowes, CEO of Harvey Bowes Property Finance Brokers. Thank you for coming both up to London and into the programme. So thank you both very much indeed. That's all from me, Stephen Galpin, today. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.